Margaret stood at her kitchen window watching the snow fall harder than she had seen in years, and the wind howled through the pine trees surrounding her small cabin in the mountains, and she thought about how different her life had turned out. From what she had imagined when she was young, she was 53 now, and her daughter Emma was only 8 years old, and people in town still whispered about her situation. But Margaret had learned long ago that the opinions of others mattered, far less than the love she had for her child and the quiet life they had built together in this remote place. The cabin had belonged to her father, and when her marriage fell apart 5 years ago, she had come here seeking peace and solitude, and she had found it in the rhythm of the seasons and the simple work of keeping a home and raising her daughter and teaching her about kindness and resilience. That particular evening in late November, the temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and Margaret had just finished making hot cocoa for Emma when she heard the sound of motorcycles struggling up the mountain road, and she wondered who would be foolish enough to ride in such weather. She wrapped her wool shawl around her shoulders and stepped out onto the porch and through the swirling snow. She could see headlights approaching slowly, and then she saw them in a group of motorcycles covered in ice and snow with riders hunched against the brutal wind. The lead rider pulled up near her cabin and removed his helmet, and his beard was frozen and his face was red from the cold. And he looked at her with desperation in his eyes. "We got caught in this storm," and he said, and his voice was rough but respectful. "And we have women, and even a couple of older riders with us, and I know this is asking a lot, but we need shelter, or some of us might not make it through the night." Margaret looked at this man and saw past the leather jacket and the intimidating appearance. And she saw a father or maybe a grandfather and someone who was responsible for the safety of others, and she thought about what her own father would have done. "How many of you are there?" And she asked 25, and he said, "And I know it is a lot, and we can sleep on the floor and we will pay you, and we just need to get warm." Emma had come to the door and was peering out from behind her mother, and her eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear, because Margaret had raised her to see people for who they were inside, and not what they looked like on the outside. Margaret made her decision in that moment, and she nodded and bring them in, and she said, "And we will figure it out." The gratitude on that man's face was something she would never forget, and he turned and signaled to the others, and soon her small cabin was filled with cold and shivering bikers and men and women of all ages, and stamping their feet and trying to warm their hands. Margaret moved into action, and she pulled out every blanket she owned and started making coffee and hot tea, and Emma helped her pass out towels so people could dry off, and the bikers were careful and respectful, and they thanked her repeatedly, and some had tears in their eyes from the relief of being somewhere warm. The lead rider introduced himself as Frank, and he was 62 years old and had been riding motorcycles since he was 16, and this was his club, and more like a family really, and they took annual trips together, and they had misjudged the weather, and the storm had come in faster and harder than anyone predicted. "My wife Linda is over there," and Frank said, and pointing to a woman with silver hair who was helping an elderly man remove his frozen gloves. "And that is my brother George, and he is 70, and this cold was getting to him." Bad Margaret brought George a cup of hot coffee and wrapped a quilt around his shoulders, and the same quilt her grandmother had made, and he looked up at her with watery blue eyes. "And bless you," and he whispered, "and you are an angel." She smiled and patted his hand, "and no angel." And she said, "And just someone who remembers what it is like to need help." As the evening wore on, Margaret made soup and sandwiches, and the bikers pooled their money and insisted on giving her several $100s, and she tried to refuse, but Frank was firm, and "You are saving lives tonight." And he said, "And please take it." Emma sat on the floor talking to Linda, and who told her stories about riding across the country and seeing the Grand Canyon and the ocean and all the beautiful places in America, and Emma listened with wonder and asked question after question. Margaret watched her daughter and felt her heart swell. And this was what she wanted for Emma, and to see the good in people and to understand that kindness was the most important thing, and more important than money or status or what anyone thought. The bikers settled in for the night, and some on the floor, and some sitting up in chairs, and a few in sleeping bags they had brought, and Margaret gave up her bed to George and the oldest among them, and she would sleep in the chair by the fire. Before everyone drifted off to sleep, Frank stood up and cleared his throat and I just want to say something, and he said, and his voice thick with emotion, and what you did tonight and letting strangers into your home and taking care of us like family, and that is rare and that is real humanity, and we will not forget it. The room was quiet, and then someone started clapping, and soon everyone was applauding, and Margaret felt her face flush, and she shook her head, and any decent person would do the same, and she said, but she knew in her heart that was not always true. That night, as the storm raged outside and the cabin was filled with the gentle sounds of sleeping people, and Margaret sat by the fire and reflected on her life. And she thought about all the times she had felt alone and judged and ashamed of her circumstances, and a single mother at 45 and divorced and struggling. But tonight she felt rich, and not in money but in purpose, and she had given shelter and warmth and safety, and she had shown her daughter what it meant to be human and what it meant to love your neighbor. Morning came slowly, and the storm had passed, and leaving everything covered in a thick blanket of white, and the world outside looked clean and new and peaceful. The bikers began to stir, and stretching sore muscles and folding blankets, and Margaret made coffee and started breakfast and scrambling eggs and making toast for 27 people, and a task that seemed impossible, but somehow felt joyful. As they prepared to leave, Frank approached Margaret again. "And we want to do something for you," and he said, "and you gave us everything last night and let us give back." Margaret started to protest, but he held up his hand, and "Just wait." And he said, "And you will see." The bikers put on their cold weather gear and started, their motorcycles and the engines rumbling to life in the crisp morning air. And they waved goodbye, and Emma and Margaret stood on the porch waving back and watching them disappear down the mountain road. "Well," and Margaret said to Emma, "and that was quite an adventure." Emma nodded, and they were nice, and she said, "And I liked Linda." And she said, "I could be anything I wanted to be when I grow up." Margaret hugged her daughter close, "And you can." And she said, "And you absolutely can." They went back inside and cleaned up and putting the cabin back in order, and Margaret thought that was the end of it, and a beautiful memory and a reminder that kindness always mattered. But the next morning Margaret heard motorcycles again, and many of them, and she looked out the window and her hand flew to her mouth. The road leading to her cabin was lined with motorcycles, and dozens and maybe 100 or more, and riders stood beside their bikes and all facing her cabin. Frank was at the front, and beside him was Linda, and Margaret opened the door and walked out with Emma, and both of them stunned into silence. Frank stepped forward, and we told our story, and he said, "And about what you did, and how you opened your home and saved our lives, and word spread, and clubs from 3 states wanted to come and say thank you." Margaret looked at the sea of faces, and men and women and young and old and all different kinds of people, and united by this strange and beautiful subculture, and united now by gratitude. One by one they approached, and each biker brought something, and bags of groceries and gift cards and toys for Emma, and firewood and supplies and money, and one man brought a handmade wooden rocking chair, and another woman brought a quilt she had sewn herself. "I was homeless once," and a woman said, and her eyes bright with tears, "and someone helped me, and now I help others, and thank you for being that person." A younger man, and maybe 30, and stepped forward, and my mom raised me alone, and he said, and people looked down on us, but she taught me about kindness, and just like you are teaching your daughter, and you remind me of her. Margaret could not stop crying, and the tears running down her face, and Emma held her hand tight, and also crying and overwhelmed by the outpouring of love. Frank presented her with an envelope, and "This is from all of us," and he said, "And $20,000, and for you and for Emma, and for being the kind of person the world needs more of." Margaret tried to refuse, and shaking her head, and "I cannot," and she said, but Frank was firm, "You can and you will," and he said, "And you let us into your home when we were strangers and desperate, and you trusted us and fed us and kept us safe, and this is not payment, and this is family taking care of family." The bikers stayed for hours and sharing food and stories and laughter, and Emma rode on the back of Linda's motorcycle, and just a slow circle around the cabin, and her face shining with pure joy. Margaret sat with George, and who had returned with the group, and he held her hand, and "You know what you did," and he said, "And you reminded all of us why we ride and why we call each other brothers and sisters, and